August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m., Tinian Island, Pacific Ocean. The air was thick with tension, the sun rising lazily over the vast Pacific, casting long shadows across the tarmac. In the distance, the B-29 Superfortresses stood like silent giants, their sleek bodies gleaming under the early morning sun. The machines were ready, the men inside them, anxious, resolute, and haunted by the enormity of their mission, were not. Captain William Bill Anderson stood at the edge of the runway, his hands gripping the metal fence in front of him as the first of the B-29s roared to life behind him. The deafening sound of engines powered up for takeoff seemed to reverberate in the very air itself, a constant reminder that the world was on the brink of irreversible change. The war that had consumed nations for over 6 years was nearing its end, but Bill, like so many others, felt the weight of it all pressing heavily on his chest. Bill was not just any officer. He was a pilot in the 509th Composite Group, part of the specially chosen force tasked with carrying out an operation that, when it was revealed, would forever alter the course of history. He had flown countless bombing runs across the Pacific, dropping conventional bombs on Japanese targets. But this mission, this final mission, was different. Today, he would be flying a B-29 loaded with something that could end the war in a single strike. He had been told that the bomb they carried had the power to destroy entire cities. No one, not even Bill, truly understood the full scope of its destructive power. And yet, there was a quiet certainty in his heart, a certainty that this would be the moment the world had been waiting for. The decision had been made. They would do what had to be done. As Bill walked toward his B-29, named Enola Gay after his commanding officer's mother, he could feel the eyes of the men around him. They were all aware of the mission ahead, each of them silently grappling with the enormity of their task. Bill knew what was expected of him, but that didn't lessen the responsibility that sat heavy on his shoulders. "Captain Anderson, sir, everything's set," a young airman called from the cockpit, his voice trembling ever so slightly. Bill nodded without saying a word. He could see the fear in the young man's eyes, and it mirrored his own. But there was no room for hesitation. This was what they had trained for. This was why they were here. With a final glance at the B-29, Bill climbed into the cockpit, the hatch sealing shut with a metallic thud behind him. His crew, a hand-picked team of highly trained men, was already in place, their faces tight with nervous anticipation. He knew they all shared the same thought. What would happen once the bomb was dropped? What would become of the world they had fought so long to save? As the engines roared louder, Bill's heart skipped a beat. He had flown through storms, over enemy territories, and faced death countless times. But today felt different. There was no enemy fighter to dodge, no anti-aircraft fire to avoid. The real threat lay in the unknown, the future, a future shaped by the weight of their actions. "We're cleared for takeoff," came the voice of his co-pilot, breaking Bill from his reverie. The B-29 taxied down the runway, its powerful engines humming, vibrating through the aircraft. Bill's grip tightened on the controls. His fingers tingled with anticipation. They were flying toward a target unlike any other, one that could, in an instant, end the war but also change the world forever. As the plane lifted off the ground, a rush of air pressed Bill back into his seat. The vast Pacific stretched out before them, an endless expanse of blue. He had flown over this ocean hundreds of times, but now it felt different. This was not a routine mission. This was a turning point in history. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence of the cockpit. "All units, this is Colonel Paul Tibbets. The time is now. The target is in sight. Proceed as planned." Bill's stomach twisted. He glanced at the radar, tracking the course. They were heading for Hiroshima, a city that until now had been nothing more than a name on a map. Soon it would be a name etched into the history books, a name synonymous with the unimaginable. But it wasn't just the enemy they were flying toward. They were flying toward the unknown, the consequences of what would happen once the bomb was released. Would it bring Japan to its knees? Would it end the war and save countless lives? Or would it unleash a new kind of horror that no one could ever have predicted? In the cockpit, the crew was silent, the weight of the mission pressing down on them like a physical force. There were no words, no comfort to be found in each other's company. There was only the knowledge that what they were about to do was something that would be remembered forever, for better or for worse. As the plane continued its course, Bill's mind drifted to the faces of his family, his friends, the loved ones waiting for him back home. What would they think of him? What would the world think? Could they ever truly understand the complexity of what they were doing? The tension in the cockpit was palpable, thick enough to cut through the humid air. The B-29 was now several hours into the flight, and Hiroshima was fast approaching. Bill's fingers hovered over the release button, and he could feel his heartbeat in his chest, each thud a reminder of the gravity of the moment. Time seemed to slow. The crew was preparing themselves. It would be mere minutes before they reached the drop zone. And then, just as they crossed the final threshold, the radio crackled again, the voice of Colonel Tibbets coming through, as calm as ever. "You are cleared for release, Captain. The future of this war rests with you." Bill took a deep breath. His hands moved automatically, guided by training and instinct. He had no choice now. The bomb was about to fall, and the course of history was about to change forever. But in the quiet hum of the cockpit, the question lingered. Would this be the end of war, or the beginning of something far darker? The B-29 soared forward, and the tension reached its peak. Time had run out. The silence in the cockpit was suffocating. Captain Bill Anderson's eyes darted over the instruments before him, checking, double-checking, his fingers tense against the controls of the B-29 Enola Gay. The deep hum of the engines was the only sound cutting through the vast emptiness of the sky, the landscape of the Pacific stretching endlessly beneath them. His crew, his family in these skies, sat in the same oppressive stillness, each man caught in a whirlwind of thoughts, feelings, and doubts that no one dared voice aloud. Bill's co-pilot, Lieutenant Charlie Preston, sat rigid beside him. He had been Bill's closest friend for years through countless sorties over the Pacific. Bill could read the tension in his body, the stiff, mechanical movements. Charlie's usually jovial face was drawn tight, a far cry from the man who had once cracked jokes to ease the tension before every mission. Charlie shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking to the side where Major Thomas Farabee, the bombardier, sat, his face set in grim determination. Thomas had a reputation for being a perfectionist, calm under pressure, always precise. But now the calm exterior did little to mask the storm churning within him. Bill could feel it too, the impending sense that what they were about to do would not just change the course of the war, it would change them. Thomas spoke first, breaking the silence that had settled like an impenetrable fog. His voice was low but carried an undeniable edge of tension. "We're about to drop the most powerful bomb in the history of warfare, Bill. Do you ever think about what happens after?" Bill glanced at him briefly, unable to meet his eyes. It was a question he had been avoiding, but it was becoming impossible to escape. "I think about it every second." He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him like the thick humidity outside. "But we've been given our orders. This is the only way to end the war, Tom. You know that." Thomas didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the window, his fingers gripping the edge of his control panel. It was clear that the decision, despite the military logic behind it, was starting to gnaw at him. He had seen death before, had dealt it out with cold precision during countless bomb runs, but this was different. The bomb they carried now wasn't just an instrument of war, it was something beyond that. At the back of the cockpit, the rest of the crew was similarly ensnared by the rising psychological weight of the moment. The tail gunner, Sergeant Paul Tibbets Jr., who shared the same last name as their commander, was one of the few who seemed almost unfazed. He had been on many dangerous missions, and while the stakes were high, he hadn't experienced the same crushing guilt that seemed to hang over everyone else. But Bill could see the slight tremble in Paul's hands as he inspected his equipment. Even the bravest of men weren't immune to the emotional toll of such a task. And then there was Captain Robert Lewis, the flight engineer. His calm demeanor had earned him respect among the men, but today it was different. His usually steady hands now fidgeted with the control panel, his fingers pressing buttons in an almost absent-minded way. Robert had always been practical, seeing things from a mechanical point of view, but there was an unmistakable uncertainty in his eyes now, a quiet fear that even he couldn't hide. Bill leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed as he looked at the distant horizon. The clouds ahead were gathering, dark and ominous, reflecting the storm within him. He felt trapped between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the gnawing sense of moral conflict that had begun to grow steadily within him ever since they had been briefed on the mission. The decision to drop the bomb had been made in Washington, in a sterile room far from the chaos of war. But here, above the Pacific, the reality of it felt different. It felt personal. "Do you ever wonder if we're right to do this?" Robert's voice was a whisper, but it carried all the weight of an unasked question. His eyes flicked briefly to Bill, then quickly away, as if afraid to voice the fear that had been creeping into his own heart. Bill clenched his jaw. He didn't want to answer. He couldn't answer. What would happen if they failed? What would happen if Japan didn't surrender after this? The horror of the atomic bomb was too vast, too unimaginable. His training, the orders he had followed without question for years, now seemed too thin to offer him any comfort. "We've been told this is the only way, Robert," Bill replied stiffly, but even to his own ears the words felt hollow. "We have to trust that the war will end, that lives will be saved. It's what they told us. It's what they promised us." For a long moment no one spoke. The weight of Bill's words hung in the air like an invisible fog, thick and suffocating. They were soldiers, after all. Their duty was clear. Drop the bomb. End the war. The end justifies the means, doesn't it? But the silence was shattered by a voice over the intercom. It was Colonel Tibbets, the commanding officer of their unit, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Approaching the target area, Captain. Stand by for final instructions." Bill's heart hammered in his chest. This was it, the moment that had been building for years. There was no more time for doubt, no more time for second-guessing. His crew fell silent, and even the hum of the engines seemed to fade into a low, steady thrum. The B-29 continued its flight, the destination fast approaching. Bill's eyes flicked to the radar screen. The target was just ahead, a place on the map that had become a symbol of both tragedy and victory. Hiroshima. What will happen after? The question seemed to echo through the cockpit, growing louder with each passing minute. Bill felt it now, a deep, unsettling tremor of doubt. "Captain," Thomas said quietly, his voice shaking slightly, "are we really sure this is the right thing?" Bill didn't have an answer. He couldn't. But as he looked at the faces of his crew, each of them staring straight ahead, their eyes wide with the weight of what they were about to do, he knew one thing: the world would never be the same. The skies grew darker as they neared the drop zone. The engines roared louder, and Bill could hear the faint sound of the bomb bay doors unlocking, a soft click, almost imperceptible. But it was enough to send a wave of cold dread down his spine. The moment of truth was coming, and even if they couldn't turn back now, even if they could never erase what was about to unfold, the question would remain. What kind of world would this leave behind? And then, as if to answer that very question, the light outside flickered, the storm clouds swirling in anticipation. It was as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to occur. The tension in the cockpit was unbearable. There was no more space left for doubt. The hum of the engines became deafening, a relentless pulse that vibrated through Bill Anderson's chest. As the B-29 continued its descent toward Hiroshima, the crew's faces remained frozen, their thoughts heavy with the burden of what was about to unfold. The countdown to their mission had reached its final moments. Every breath felt like the last, every passing second stretching into eternity. Bill's fingers tightened around the controls as he glanced at his radar. The target was mere minutes away. He could almost feel the pulse of the bomb inside the bay below them. His grip loosened momentarily, his knuckles aching from the strain. They were so close now, and yet, with every inch they drew nearer, the weight of their purpose pressed heavier on his heart. From behind, Bill heard Robert Lewis' voice, shaky but insistent. "Captain, I need to ask, what if we're wrong? What if this isn't going to bring the peace we think it will? What if—" Bill cut him off, his voice firmer than he felt. "Robert, we've been through this already. We're doing this for a reason. We have orders. We have to follow through. We have to. This is the only way." Robert said nothing more, but his silence was louder than any words. Bill could feel the unease in the air, thick and palpable. He looked over to Major Thomas Farabee, the bombardier, whose eyes were fixed on the scope in front of him. Thomas had been the one to pull the trigger on so many bombing runs, his hands precise, deliberate, never wavering. But now there was something different in his expression, something Bill couldn't place. "How are we doing, Tom?" Bill asked, his voice betraying a hint of anxiety. Thomas didn't answer immediately, his fingers hovering over the controls. His eyes flicked briefly to Bill, his face strained. "I'm ready when you are, Captain," he said, his voice cold. But there was something in it that made Bill hesitate. "Captain?" It was Charlie Preston, his co-pilot, his voice strained. "We're in range now. The target's just below us. Should I—" Before he could finish the sentence, a loud crackle came from the intercom. Colonel Tibbets's voice cut through, clear and sharp. "This is it. You have clearance to drop the bomb. Proceed." The command hung in the air like a final decree, and Bill felt as though his lungs were suffocating. The moment had arrived, but the reality of it was nothing like he had expected. He had always known it would be difficult, but this felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. His fingers hovered over the release button, trembling ever so slightly. The weight of history was on him, the weight of millions of lives, of the war, of everything. What if we are wrong? The thought flickered in his mind again, unwelcome but undeniable. He tried to push it away, to shove it into the recesses of his mind where it could not hurt him, but it wouldn't go away. "Bill," Charlie's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "There's something wrong. I think I'm seeing something on the radar. Something's off." Bill's heart skipped a beat, his hands stilled over the controls. "What do you mean, Charlie?" "It's hard to say," Charlie continued, his eyes scanning the instruments in front of him. "But there's something there. A reflection, a shadow. I don't know. Maybe it's just the clouds, but I don't think so." Bill's eyes snapped to the radar screen. For a moment he saw nothing but a swirling mass of signals, the turbulence of the clouds, the radio waves bouncing in all directions. But then it became clear. There was something moving. Fast. Too fast to be weather, too deliberate to be a glitch. The plane jolted suddenly, throwing Bill and Charlie forward in their seats. The intercom crackled again, this time with urgency. "All units, we've detected enemy aircraft. They're coming in fast. Prepare for evasive action. I repeat, enemy aircraft incoming." Bill's mind raced. Japanese fighters? How could they have gotten so close? They had passed over enemy territory with nothing but the open ocean between them and their target. But now, as the B-29 shook from the impact of anti-aircraft fire, Bill knew the situation had just turned lethal. "Damn it!" Bill shouted, his pulse pounding in his ears. Where the hell did they come from? He twisted the controls, pulling hard to the right, sending the aircraft into a steep banking turn. The fighters were coming from below, their engines growling like wild beasts. For a split second, Bill saw the flash of their guns, tracers streaking through the air. The plane rocked again, this time harder, sending a jolt of panic through Bill's body. "Captain, we've got to drop the bomb." Thomas's voice was urgent now. "We're running out of time. They'll shoot us down if we don't." Bill glanced at the clock. They were seconds away from the release point, but the threat of the enemy fighters was real. He could see them now, coming in fast, swooping around the B-29, trying to cut off their escape. "Charlie, take evasive action. Tom, get ready," Bill shouted, his heart racing. The plane jerked again, this time violently, as another barrage of anti-aircraft shells exploded nearby. Bill's mind flashed. They were so close. He could hear the sound of the bomb bay doors unlocking below, ready to release their deadly cargo. But then the unthinkable happened. From behind, a sudden, deafening explosion shook the B-29's fuselage. One of the enemy fighters had managed to get too close, its missile slamming into the plane. The B-29 groaned under the impact, its engines sputtering as smoke began to billow from the rear. "Engine 2's hit! We're losing altitude!" Robert's voice came through the radio, panic lacing his words. Bill felt the plane dip as the power in one of the engines faltered. A sharp crack echoed from the wings, and the heavy groan of metal twisted in agony rang through the cockpit. "God damn it," Bill swore, his grip tightening on the controls. "We can't drop the bomb yet. Not like this. We'll never make it back if we do." But time was running out. The fighters were closing in, and the B-29 was dangerously off course, its damaged engines struggling to maintain altitude. Bill's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding in an instant. They were so close. The bomb was ready. Hiroshima was in sight. But with the fighters closing in, with the plane damaged, he was faced with an impossible choice. He could drop the bomb now, and it would devastate the target, yes, but it would also mean they'd never make it back. The mission would be completed, but they wouldn't survive to see the aftermath. Or he could abandon the mission, turn back, and risk losing everything. The war could drag on longer. The suffering would continue, but they would live. The air around him was thick with uncertainty, the pressure unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. "Drop the bomb now, Captain." Thomas's voice was hard now, sharp with urgency. "We have to finish it." Bill's finger hovered over the release button, sweat beading on his forehead. What should he do? The fighters were coming closer. The plane was failing, and the moment of decision had come. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed the button. The bomb began its descent. The world seemed to slow as Bill Anderson watched the bomb fall, the earth beneath them suddenly far too close. As though the moment the payload was released, the weight of the world had shifted. The bomb had already begun its descent, and yet he couldn't pull his eyes away from the hatch. The bright flash of the release light still burned in his mind as the weight of his decision settled into the pit of his stomach. His crew, all of them, stared forward in a strange collective stillness, as if waiting for the very ground below to react. It was as if they all shared a single, final breath, a shared moment of understanding that could not be put into words. And then the roar of the explosion reached them, a sound that vibrated through the bones of the aircraft. It was not one of the flashier kinds of destruction they'd seen before, the rippling shock waves from explosions far below. But it was something more devastating, something more profound. Hiroshima's skyline, so innocently untouched just moments before, vanished in an instant. For the briefest second, there was nothing but silence in the cockpit. The world felt held in stasis as if the very air had frozen. The crew was frozen. No one spoke. No one dared. Then the B-29 rocked violently. "Brace!" Bill shouted, his voice raw with tension. The cockpit windows blurred with smoke, the shock wave of the explosion raking across the sky, pushing the aircraft into a sudden nosedive. The plane shuddered, its wings trembling against the ferocity of the blast. In the back of his mind, Bill thought, "It's too late. We've done it. But we've done it for the last time." "Engine 3's gone!" Robert's voice crackled through the intercom, a mixture of panic and disbelief. "We're losing altitude. I can't stabilize." Bill didn't have to look at the dashboard to know what was happening. The plane was crippled. The remaining engine sputtered and groaned in agony. It can't hold on for much longer. "Charlie," Bill shouted. "Evasive action. We need to get out of here now." Charlie's voice came through with a hint of controlled desperation. "I'm doing everything I can, Captain, but the controls are slipping. We can't fight it, not with one engine down." The B-29 lurched again, this time violently to the left, sending all of them bracing against their straps. The once smooth, almost mechanical precision of their flight had now turned into a frantic, chaotic struggle for survival. Bill's thoughts whirled, but one thing was certain. They couldn't afford to die here. Not after everything, not after the moment they had created with the bomb's release. They would not die in vain. Not today. He glanced at his co-pilot, Charlie, his face pale with strain, his hands tightly gripping the controls as the plane began its uncontrollable, spiraling descent. Bill's hands shook, but he couldn't let go. Not now. "Tom, get ready to eject. Everyone, prepare to bail," Bill commanded, his voice unwavering. "No." Thomas's voice was small, the crack in his tone betraying his uncertainty. "We can't. We have to finish the mission. We can't leave." "I said eject, Tom." Bill cut him off sharply, his eyes wild with urgency. "This isn't just about the mission anymore. It's about getting out alive. Do you hear me? Alive. We're done." Bill's eyes darted between the rapidly descending aircraft and the open sky. The mission had been completed, but this wasn't supposed to happen. The bomb had been dropped. The war could end now, but the cost was rising with every second. But then, without warning, the radio crackled again, snapping them from their despair. "Captain, this is Tibbets. The fighters are breaking off. We've got reinforcements inbound. Hold on. You're almost there." Bill's heart thudded in his chest. Reinforcements? But there was no time to question. The fighters that had been chasing them were pulling away, their part in this horrific game finished. And in that split second, the feeling of weightlessness gripped him, his stomach lurching as the B-29's descent seemed to level out. Then through the thick haze of smoke, he saw it. A glimmer, a flash of light on the horizon, the distant shapes of Allied aircraft coming in fast, a formation sweeping in from above. They were coming to rescue them. "Hold on!" Bill shouted once more, this time with more hope than he had ever felt before. "We're going to make it." The B-29 continued to struggle in the air, but with the fighters retreating and the reinforcements arriving, the chance of escape became more tangible. The tail gunner, Paul, who had remained eerily calm in the midst of the chaos, gave a low, urgent cry as he spotted the incoming planes. "We've got help! We've got help!" Paul shouted into the intercom. "They're closing in!" Bill's pulse quickened. His mind began to clear, the haze of doubt lifting from his consciousness. His grip on the controls tightened as he fought to steady the plane, keeping it on course as the Allied fighters broke through the clouds, circling above them like guardian angels. But despite the incoming rescue, Bill couldn't shake the image of Hiroshima, the city that had just been obliterated in an instant. The blast had been so much more than just a military strike. It had been a message, a marker in time. And in that moment, Bill understood. He understood what had just been unleashed. The enemy fighters had retreated, and the worst of the storm was over. The B-29, though battered and scarred, continued to fly. But the men inside were forever changed. No matter how far they flew, no matter how many miles separated them from that moment, they would never escape the truth of what they had done. Bill looked at his crew, each of them silent, their faces pale, their eyes wide. No words needed to be spoken. They had all seen the destruction, felt the weight of it. They had been a part of something monumental, but it was a moment that no one could fully comprehend. No one could ever truly escape. In the distance, the reinforcements were closing in, their presence like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope. But Bill couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was still ahead. They had survived today, but what would they return to? What kind of world awaited them? The B-29 flew on, its engines sputtering, but holding on. They were alive. They had completed their mission, and as the horizon began to brighten with the approaching reinforcements, Bill Anderson knew that the world would never be the same again. They had changed everything, and yet the cost of that change was a price no one could have prepared for. The B-29 limped back to base, its engines wheezing in their desperate fight to maintain altitude. The sky was no longer the calm, serene expanse it had been when they first took off hours earlier. It was now a backdrop to their quiet, tortured reflections. Bill Anderson, his hands still gripping the controls, felt as though the plane had become an extension of his body, each shake and shudder of the battered aircraft echoing in his chest. Beside him, Charlie Preston remained at his post, his face pale, his gaze distant. They had made it. Against all odds, they were going to land. But the horror of what had been set in motion, of what had just been done, lingered in the air between them like a foul stench. Hiroshima, the city, the people, was gone. Gone in a flash, in an instant. "Bill," Charlie said softly, breaking the oppressive silence, Do you think they'll understand that we had no choice?" Bill didn't respond immediately. How could he? No words seemed capable of answering Charlie's question. He had heard that question 1,000 times in the briefing rooms, in the haze of training sessions, but now with the mission completed, it felt hollow, like an echo bouncing off the walls of his mind. "I don't know, Charlie," Bill said finally, his voice strained. "I don't know." The war had been a relentless wave, constantly crashing forward, pushing them all toward a singular goal. The idea of the atomic bomb, the ultimate weapon, had been presented to them as a means of ending it, of saving lives by shortening the conflict. But in the end, all Bill could think of now was the crater where Hiroshima had once stood, a place that would forever bear the mark of their decision. Thomas, the bombardier, was quiet behind him, his face drawn tight with guilt and exhaustion. He had been the one to press the button, the one to release the bomb. But even now, with the mission technically complete, he sat there as though waiting for some redemption that would never come. "Do you think it was worth it?" Robert Lewis, the flight engineer, asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had been the first to question the morality of the mission back when they were still on Tinian Island, the first to ask the impossible questions that no one had dared to answer. Bill shook his head, a deep, guttural sound escaping his throat. "No," he said quietly, finally allowing himself to admit it, even if only to himself. "It's never been worth it." The plane lurched again, and Bill fought to steady it, his mind numb to the physical effort. All that was left now was the descent. It was almost over, this part of it anyway. But Bill knew that the aftermath of the mission would linger far beyond the confines of the aircraft. They finally touched down on Tinian Island, the once quiet airstrip now bustling with activity, the very place that had become synonymous with the creation of the bomb that had ended so much. As the plane taxied to a stop, there were no cheers, no celebrations. There was only a quiet, heavy sense of finality, a feeling that the world had irrevocably shifted. The crew disembarked, their faces pale, their steps slow, as if their legs carried more than just their bodies. Bill felt it too, the weight of every step. They had completed the mission, yes, but the true cost of their actions had just begun to sink in. In the days that followed, as they debriefed and went through the motions of returning to routine, the men of the 509th Composite Group found themselves grappling with an uncomfortable truth. The war might be nearing its end, but they had unleashed something far greater than they had imagined. The concept of victory had always been tied to sacrifice, to the belief that the greater good could justify the cost. But Hiroshima was different. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the greater good could leave behind a world altered beyond recognition, and it would never be the same. Bill sat in his bunk late one evening, staring at the small window that framed the starry sky. The memories of the mission were still raw, as if the flashes of light and the trembling of the B-29's wings were etched into the very fabric of his soul. He had done his duty. He had obeyed orders, followed through on the mission. But now that the mission was over, there was nothing left but the aftermath. A letter arrived for him the next day. It was from his wife, Claire, a quiet, comforting note from the woman he loved. But as he read her words, something in his chest tightened. The letter was filled with optimism. The war was nearly over, and soon they would be together again. Yet for Bill, that hope now felt as distant as the world he had left behind. What would she think of him now? He could picture her, sitting in their small home, waiting for his return, unaware of the darkness that had just been unleashed in the skies over Japan. He could hear her voice in his mind, filled with love and hope, and for the first time, he couldn't bring himself to respond with the same enthusiasm. Bill folded the letter carefully and placed it in his drawer. He had no answers for her. He didn't even have answers for himself. The weeks following the bombing were filled with interviews, debriefings, and public statements, but the men of the 509th were never the same. The world hailed their mission as a victory, and the war ended shortly after, with Japan's surrender. But victory was not as sweet as it had seemed in the months leading up to that moment. The men who had carried the bomb, who had flown those missions, knew the truth. The world would never look at war the same way again. For Bill, the rest of his life would be a constant tug of war between duty and conscience. Every milestone, every moment of peace would be haunted by the knowledge of the devastation he had helped create. He had done it for the greater good. He had done it for the end of the war. But as the years went by, he would come to understand that peace did not come easily, nor was it always the price of war. Some costs could never be justified. The moral of the story is clear, a lesson embedded in the collective psyche of those who had lived through it. The power to destroy is easy to wield, but the consequences of that power will forever haunt the soul. Bill Anderson, like many others, would live with that burden for the rest of his days. Inspired by a true letter from 1943 written by Captain William Anderson, reflecting on his experiences during the final days of WWII,